want to thank everybody for coming today to the South Kohala Coastal Partnership Speaker Series. And I am Lauren Krupita, the coordinator of the partnership. And the goal of this speaker series is to provide an opportunity to learn more about the partners and the work being done. And the catalyst that started this partnership was that the State Division of Aquatic Resources and the Coral Reef Working Group identified South Kohala as a priority area for the Hawaii Coral Reef Strategy to implement actions to reduce anthropogenic impacts to our coastal reef ecosystems. Through community interest and engagement, the partnership was formed in 2012. And in 2018, over 30 organizations and agencies participated in creating the South Kohala Conservation Action Plan 2030 that outlines 6 specific strategies to guide the partnership collaboratively towards working to restore and protect coastal resources. Today, we are honored to have Mia Akau-LaClair, who is the Kohala Center Director of Kohala Papahana. She is from Pu'ukapu, Waimea, and comes from multiple generations of Aina practitioners from Waimea, Kauai High, and Kohala. Mia's kuleana focuses on cultivating and nurturing strengthened relationships for Kohala through Papahana, unified applied actions. And also we have Kaimana Chock, who is the Aina Accountabilities Pathways Manager for the Kohala Center. Born and raised on Oahu, carries a strong genealogical ties to Kohala and Waipio. His work seeks to answer the questions, how might we hold ourselves accountable to the places, communities, and individuals that feed us physically, mentally, and spiritually? They're both here to present on Kohala Watershed practices and the Honokoa Watershed improvements. And thank you to you both.
Mahalo. I am going to share screen and then we can get started.
Hi.
Mahalo everybody for joining us today. Mia and I are so honored to be a part of the South Kohala Coastal Partnership Speaker Series and to share with you today about our Kohala Stewardship practices and Honokoa Watershed improvements. Our talk today will be broken up into 4 primary parts. We'll start with introductions and context setting, talk about our stewardship practices and improvements, spend a little time with the current projects that we're working on at the Kohala Center, and then also have some time for questions from the audience. So let's get started with introductions and context settings. We always like to start all of our gatherings together with an aloha circle. Aloha circle is a way for us to introduce ourselves to each other, as well as to the common space that we'll be sharing. And so we invite you to participate in this aloha circle along with us. We'll be sharing 4 names, the name of Aina, Wai or Kai, Kupuna or Kumu, and then your own name. And so Mia and I will share our names out loud, but we invite you to join us by sharing those names in the chat. And so again, we'll be sharing the name of Aina, a place that has fed and cared for you, whether that be where you live, where you slept last night, the place that you grew up. You'll share a name of Wai or Kai, a source of fresh or salt water that has nourished you, that you feel very connected to. Share the name of a kupuna or kumu, an ancestor or a teacher who inspires you. And then finally, share your own name. So I'll share first, and then I'll hand it over to Mia. And like I said, please feel free to share your own names in the chat as well. The Aina that I'd like to bring into our circle today is the Aina of Keawewai, which is an ili Aina na hele hele located in the ahupua'a of Kauai High Ekahi or Kauai High Komohana. The way that I want to bring into our circle is the way of Kilohana, which is one of the streams that borders Keawewai. The kupuna I'd like to bring into our circle is the a'ali'i plant, because we can learn so much from it. And my name is Kaimana Chock. Aloha mai kākou.
Mahalo, Kaimana. Today, I'll start with aloha kako. Mahalo, everyone, for joining us today. The aina I'd like to bring to our circle is Kaihai-uka, or the region of Kohala, the upper reaches of Kaihai, that today includes both our pasture and our forested land. And I would go to this area with my dad as a keiki to hunt pig and pick maile. So it was a very special place to our ohana. And I'd like to bring the uhiwai, which is the fog that would roll into this area. And sometimes it was so thick that you couldn't see right in front of you. And our weather this morning in Waimea was reminding me of the uhiwai. So I'll bring that today. And then the kupuna, of course, I'll be bringing my dad, Arnold Akau. He had an intimate knowledge of the west side of Mokuokeawe. He was a hunterman and a fisherman, and he worked for Parker Ranch. And my name is Mia Akau-LaClair. Mahalo.
Mahalo, Mia.
So we'll start off with also an introduction to the Kohala Center. And the Kohala Center that we're grateful to be a part of is an aina and community-based nonprofit based in North Hawaii. Our main office is located in Waimea town, but we have kuleana to care for lands across Hawaii Island, including Kohala, Hamakua, and Kahalu'u. We began in the year 2000 in response to requests from island leaders and residents to create greater employment and educational opportunities by caring for and celebrating Hawaii's unique natural and cultural landscape. Our mission is to respectfully engage the island of Hawaii by returning ancestral knowledge and research into daily practice. As a community of practitioners, TKC envisions a state of pono indicated by thriving forests, food, and coastal ecosystems.
Our talk today is really inspired by two projects that were completed at the end of last year. The first of which was our Kauai Ekahi, or Honokoa Watershed and Marine Resiliency Project. This project was supported by the NOAA National Marine Fisheries Service and ran from October 2017 to September 2022. The goal of this project was to reduce erosion and sedimentation of the nearshore environment in order to improve coral ecosystem health and marine habitats within the NOAA West Hawaii Habitat Blueprint Focus Area. This project was completed in partnership with the Kailapa community and the Department of Hawaiian Homelands, whose collaboration made this work possible. A range of restoration activities were completed, some of which were guided by community-based decision-making processes and included construction of ungulate-proof fencing, removal of invasive species, and outplanting of native dryland and mesic forest species, especially in riparian corridors. These activities will be detailed later in the presentation with a little bit more detail. The bulk of the activities that were completed through this project were centered around Keawewai, an approximately 60-acre parcel of land stewarded by the Kohala Center, just mauka of Honokoa Gulch. Thanks to our collaboration with DHHL, the Kailapa community, and our neighbors at Kalopi Ranch, we were able to extend our restoration activities beyond our own property to enclose portions of Kilohana and Keawewai streams, the beginning of Honokoa Gulch, as well as the perimeter of the Kailapa community.
The community-based ecosystem assessment project is the second project we'd like to introduce today. This project was supported by the USDOI Bureau of Reclamation Water Smart program, and it was a 2-year project that ran from August 2020 to September 2022. So it really aligned with the Honokoa project in terms of time frame. The purpose of this project was to recommend a set of best management practices that are effective and impactful in improving watershed health to be utilized in future management. And the project had 4 phases. So identify, evaluate, design and test, and finalize. So the first phase was to identify accomplishments of work conducted in Kohala's watersheds. So we looked back at about 10 years worth of data, during which time the Kohala Center was responsible for coordinating the Kohala Watershed Partnership, or KWP. So the KWP is a watershed group comprised of the major landowners on Kohala Mountain that works to protect Kohala's water and forest resources. So in summarizing the many accomplishments that happened across the mountain, we determined that there were a couple of primary conservation activities implemented in Kohala's watersheds. So we had ungulate-proof fencing, we had invasive plant and animal removal, and native species outplanting. So that brings us to our second phase, where we evaluated the impact of these practices through site visits with our staff team and partners, and Ho'aina days with Ho'aina Day experiences with community in places that were accessible. So one of the key lessons that we learned from the evaluation was that there was not consistent presence in these spaces due to funding. Records were also lacking detailing the conservation practices and impact or change to the landscape over time based on the practices conducted. So the general conclusion of our evaluation was that these common conservation practices were important to continue, but that additional practices were needed to develop and deepen our relationship with Kohala and truly understand how to be good caretakers. And so during the design and test phase, we looked to Aina and came up with several cultural practices that we wanted to apply as practitioners along with community. By including community and applying these practices, we saw firsthand the impact in a fairly short time frame of how relationships became stronger and more resilient. The importance of documenting this learning process and indicators of strengthened relationships also became very apparent during this phase of the project. So in the finalized phase, we settled on 5 stewardship practices that we recommended to be included in Kohala's watershed management efforts going forward. And these stewardship practices, along with their expected short and long-term impacts, were shared with the KWP and the USDOI as a final product of this project.
So during this section of our presentation today, we'll be introducing 6 Aina stewardship practices, the 5 that were identified through the community-based ecosystem assessment, and 1 that arose directly from our work in Honokoa. We will be introducing each of these practices, describing their implementation in Honokoa, and also sharing a retrospective about the lessons we learned by implementing these practices. The practices we'll be sharing today are Ho'olauna, Kilo, Hana, Mo'olelo, Ho'opaipai, and Aha. We use these practices internally as practitioners, as well as guiding our community through engagement with these practices. So the first of these practices, these Aina stewardship practices, is Ho'olauna, which is a process of introductions and allows us to set intentions and context for our work. We view Ho'olauna as a way for us to get to know Aina and all our Aina relations better, but also to introduce ourselves to place and our environmental kin. And we seek to identify a foundation of wholeness from which we are able to connect through our Ho'olauna. Included within the Ho'olauna process is the initial research into things like place names, names of our winds and rains, and etc. That can tell us a lot about the areas where we're going to engage in our restoration work. Through the Ho'olauna process, we first become familiarized with these names and the information contained within them, and then we shared them with our community members. And this was an opportunity to both learn alongside our community and to learn from them as well.
Our go-to Ho'olauna practice in Honokoa was the Aloha Circle, which everyone got to experience at the start of our presentation today, in which we each shared 4 names as a way to introduce ourselves and share our aloha with one another. As you can see, the circle can be a literal circle or a conceptual circle and can be conducted both in person or virtually. In Honokoa, the Aloha Circle was conducted at the start of a workday, a community hosting, or a presentation. The second way ho'olauna was applied in Honokoa was posing the question, who is Kwaihai, and encouraging the shift from aina as what to aina as who, and that comparable to a beloved grandmother or loved one deserving of our attention and care. By learning and sharing the names and personalities of Honokoa's places and environmental kin, we got to know who they are and the characteristics that make them unique. We also introduced a mele for ho'olauna purposes that was composed by our very own Kaimana Chock, entitled He Mele Aloha no Kwaihai, which describes the relationships between the places and environmental kin of Kwaihai as a way to remember their names and express our aloha. We also introduced the residents of Honokoa area as a way to ho'olauna, including our hoala'au, our native plant friends. Similar to place names, the names of our hoala'au hold information about their characteristics and growing conditions that are important to understand who they are.
Here are just a few of the lessons that we learned by engaging with ho'olauna in Honokoa. One of the most important of which was that Aloha Circle became an important process when working with our community, because it's through Aloha Circle that we are able to learn about ancestral ties to place, find shared genealogies, and create the space to connect on a deeper level emotionally and spiritually. We often found that when we would engage with Aloha Circle, people got a little choked up because they felt so emotionally connected to the places, the wai and kai, and the kupuna that they brought to the circle. And so it really created the space for us to engage on that deeper level because we all felt safe with one another. More recently, within our ho'olauna process, we have also begun to include acknowledgements to aina of our work and the role that we are going to be playing within it. So these processes, you'll see, these practices that we're sharing today are continuing to evolve through our work that we are doing even now. And so by stating our intentions, not only to each other, but also to the spaces that we're operating within, we acknowledge that we may be coming into a space and disrupting its current process or functioning, but that this disruption is in service of creating long-term greater benefits for all. And this is important because we view aina as who and not what. And this is one way for us to acknowledge the agency that aina holds. The next practice that arose from our community-based ecosystem assessment, as well as our work in Honokoa, is the practice of kilo. Kilo is a process of observation, data collection, and monitoring that is based in embodied observation. Kilo uses our 5 physical senses and myriad other senses and sensibilities in order to learn from aina and all of our environmental kin, as well as from each other. Through the process of regular engagement with kilo, embodied observation can become embodied knowledge. That knowledge can then guide us towards making pono, responsible, and respectful decisions as we restore a place. This is especially important as we face the realities of climate change and rapidly altering conditions within our places that no longer follow previously understood and studied patterns. Kilo can help us to become experts of highly localized ecosystem knowledge.
So oftentimes kilo or monitoring is not considered the hana or the work. And this is another area where we try to shift the perspective to kilo is the hana and holding intentional space for kilo. So kilo was encouraged continuously at Honokoa throughout the project and included several types of monitoring that contributed to our overall understanding of place and impact. So a Kilo Kwaihai group was established to make regular observations and collect photos. Photo point monitoring was conducted on a quarterly basis in our newly established riparian subunits, and plant viability of recent outplants was tracked throughout the project as well. We also posed questions to ourselves and community members to guide our kilo and strengthen our knowledge of place and encourage folks to seek a response from aina. Examples of some of the questions that were asked are, what are Kwaihai, Mauka, and Makai resources? Where, when, and how should we plant so that our forests regenerate?
We learned a lot through the process of Kilo. We began to understand what are the flowering, fruiting, and seeding cycles of our many native plants that are within Honokoa. Kilo helped to guide our site selection process for our different restoration units, as we were really trying to look at how can these serve as testing grounds for restoration activities that can be implemented across the greater Honokoa landscape. And so we sought to find sites that were reflective of the many different conditions that are present throughout Honokoa. Kilo helps us to anticipate seasonal effects and understand our climate changes. And one thing that we learned about Kilo from Kilo is that consistency is really key towards developing those embodied observations into embodied knowledge. By understanding the cycles that our environment goes through and realizing that some of the indicators that we may be looking at might not be the best indicators, we can start to create better Kilo practices. So this was really guided by one of our Kilo mentors, Pilika Andrade, and she showed us a photo similar to this and asked us, is this place healthy? What does healthy look like? And so if you take in this photo, you'll see that the a'ali'i is obviously in a good place of fruiting a lot. But if you look at the grass and use that as your indicator, you might say, well, the grass is really dry, so I don't know if this place is so healthy. But what Kilo reminds us is that our environment and our ecosystem goes through different cycles and changes according to the season. And it's really important to identify which are those good indicators for health. Grass might not be the best indicator for health because it's not a part of the native ecosystem in this area. And so Kilo really helps us to be more critical about what we're observing, what are those indicators and conditions that we use to measure our overall ecosystem health. Our next practice is Hana, and Hana is representative of the cycles of applied action that we undertook. This is where the bulk of our outputs occurred from the NOAA project and where many of our traditional conservation practices fit into this framework. Through Hana, we are able to put interventions into place to see improvements in ecosystem health more directly.
So direct action in Honokoa was aimed at achieving 4 primary goals. I also want to mention that while I relate these goals to the direct action Hana, I feel like all of the stewardship practices contribute to achievement of these goals in some way. So our first goal, Malama, to care for and preserve Aina and native species. Second, Ho'oulu, to propagate and cultivate native forest plant species. Ho'omau, to perpetuate Keawewai and the Honokoa area as an ili aina na hele hele, a land division of predominantly native dryland forest. And Ho'okupu, to improve the conditions needed for forests to regenerate. And so we begin with our fencing or protection activities, which included a large perimeter fence and multiple smaller riparian subunits. So the map on the left shows the perimeter around Honokoa that was protected from Kohala Mountain Road, and then borders the Pelekane unit and wraps around Kailapa DHHL residential neighborhood. The map on the right is a close-up of 5 riparian subunits around Keawewai, Kilohana, and Honokoa streams. But there were actually a total of 6 subunits, one that was added at the end of the project that didn't make it to the map. And another thing that I wanted to mention was that one of the activities that shifted during the course of this project was the construction of sediment check dams throughout Honokoa. And if you know, sediment check dams are intended to capture sediment that wash down the mountain during large rain events. And because they end up filling up eventually, they end up being more of a temporary preventative measure for erosion control. And over time, they're costly and time consuming to maintain. So in collaboration with Kailapa community and DHHL, we proposed the creation of additional riparian subunits to protect these areas from feral goats and provide for future revegetation projects. So that was the primary reason for the additional subunits, was the shift from no longer constructing sediment check dams throughout the region. Next slide. So feral goat removal was another way in which we worked to protect the area. And one area where we worked heavily with DHHL to be inclusive of community management. The map here shows some of the potential ways goat removal could be executed throughout Honokoa. But in the long run, there was much more goats than we could remove during the course of this project. So we ended up targeting removal Makai in a trapping paddock, and you can kind of see that area pointed out down below. And then working with the DHHL lessee and our neighbors at Keaweawai, we did do some trapping up Mauka as well. And then invasive plant removal, of course, was focused on in our riparian subunits prior to planting as preparation and then maintained throughout the project. Our largest competitors in Honokoa were the eucalyptus, the glycine vine, and kikuyu grass. And then establishment of our Kilohana nursery at Keaweawai allowed us to begin collecting seeds around Honokoa, raise them in our nursery in preparation for outplanting back in our riparian subunits, essentially keeping them at home so they don't have to go through the shock of acclimating to a new space. So this was a new development that came out of the Honokoa project. And then this slide shows a snapshot of the 6 riparian subunits that were created as part of this project. We had 2 along Keaweawai stream, Keaweawai upper and Keaweawai lower. We had 3 along Kilohana, so Kilohana lower, Kilohana kula, and Kilohana pa'ola. And then we had 1 larger unit where the both streams tie into Honokoa. And these units were all selected for their proximity to the streams and their differing growing conditions, which contributed to our general knowledge of planting in each of these different spaces. And this slide is a summary of our Hana outputs. So we had a total of 14.9 miles of fencing installed around Honokoa, 1,000+ goats removed, 1,331 volunteers and staff engaged, a total of 76 acres of riparian zones protected, 25 acres revegetated, and 3,950 native plants outplanted. So lessons learned from our Hana. I wish I could put a bunch of pictures, a whole slideshow together to demonstrate the lessons learned here, but probably the most I would say meaningful to me was this picture here of our ala'a, and we also have several old growth ohia as well that were protected in our riparian areas and thriving to this day. So protecting our kupuna in these spaces. And then also seeing the visible difference between the protected and unprotected areas, the riparian subunits, and the areas that are still grazed pasture land. We have some areas that are completely decimated with no feed at all, and some areas that are actually coming back. We have a kia that's been naturally regenerating in prior pasture units, and Kauai'a naturally regenerating as well. With the establishment of our Kilohana nursery, we've been seeing greater success from plants propagated there that have been outplanted in our units. And then also seeing more bees being observed in our native in our restoration units with the addition of native outplants.
Our next practice is that of mo'olelo, which is storytelling and story catching. While mo'olelo are often thought of as myths and legends, we use mo'olelo here to capture all forms of story. We are able to deepen our research by engaging with traditional, historical, and local knowledge through the act of storytelling and story catching. When we talk about mo'olelo here, we are not only referring to the epic tales recorded in the Hawaiian language newspapers like Ki'iaka Kapoliopele, but also the citizen scientist accounts of what was going on in the late 1800s, the Paniolo stories that have been passed down through families, the data captured in Mele, and even the relationships identified through Olelo no Eo. We find that stories are one way through which we and our ancestors can essentialize important events and data so that it's easy to remember and to pass on to future generations. This is what makes mo'olelo so important. Mo'olelo allow us the space to acknowledge that we are part of and engaging with the continuum that existed before us and will continue to exist after us. And mo'olelo help us to recontextualize our relationships to the places that we are stewarding by giving us a deeper insight into the ways that these places were used and stewarded in the past, learning about the environmental kin that were present in the space, and recording our own time in history.
Through research and team discussions, traditional mo'olelo, including stories, songs, and proverbs, were analyzed to better understand the ecological features and connections our ancestors had with place. Some of the traditional mo'olelo shared in Honokoa included Hoamake ke Kula and Kamiki, both taking place at Keawewae and nearby areas of Kohala. Our gatherings with community members and residents of Kaihai provided opportunities for local knowledge to be shared through stories that helped us to understand historical land uses and their implications today. The Mahalo Circle was another way we incorporated mo'olelo into our Honokoa work. The Mahalo Circle was often held at the end of the workday or gathering for staff or community to share new stories of who showed up for them or who they are grateful for, and can serve as indicators of strengthened relationship as well. A new mo'olelo entitled He Mo'olelo Pokole no Ka Wili Wili Kui Ka Wai, also written by Kaimana, was composed and shared to honor the 100 or so wili wili grown in Kilohana Nursery and planted in Kaihai, and to document our current relationships to Aina and Kanaka.
We learned so many lessons through the various mo'olelo that were shared. Some examples were those found in stories like Hoamake ke Kula and Kamiki that told us about what some of the traditional dominant forest species may have been. Kuai'ea and Mamane near the Keawewae area, and Ohia and Olapa a little bit higher up Mauka. Some references to other species that would have been present, including Elepaio, Lama, and perhaps Mamo. And it also helped us to contextualize Olelo no Eo. So through all of the insights we gained by engaging with the prior practices of Ho'olauna, Kilo, and Hana, we're able to understand mo'olelo at deeper levels beyond what's present there at the surface. Additionally, mo'olelo can provide us with rich kilo data of past eras that give us some insights into the environmental kin that were present in a place, the conditions and environmental factors that were faced, and the recognition of changes that were occurring at past times in history. One example of mo'olelo being recontextualized through our hana during this project is the famous Olelo no Eo, or proverb, He a'ali'i ku makani maiau, a ohe makani nanae kulai, which means, I am a wind withstanding a'ali'i, no one can topple me over. This describes the a'ali'i plant, which is a symbol of resilience because of its ability to withstand high winds and drought conditions, making it an appropriate plant for use in restoration within Honokoa. Through our hana, we began to see that a'ali'i is strong because of the conditions it grows in, because it resists the winds. In one of our restoration units, where we planted very densely and watered heavily, The a'ali'i became enveloped by faster growing aveovea and ilima bushes, and we noticed that a'ali'i struggled in those conditions. Compare that to the a'ali'i that were planted at the Keawevai upper unit that face whipping winds, bare rocky soil, limited water, and harsh sun. Those a'ali'i, while not fast growers, had a surprisingly high survival rate, especially compared to other native species outplanted in the same unit. Our next practice is that of ho'opaipai, returning to daily practice. So ho'opaipai is the recognition of the importance of integrating conservation and aina stewardship activities into our daily lives in order to see real long-term changes for ecosystem health. Ho'opaipai prompts us to ask the questions, what are the practices and ways of being and living that we want to continue on long after the close of the project? What are the parts of the hana that we would like to see implemented into our daily lives? And how do we make that happen?
One way that ho'opaipai was applied in Honokoa was building our team's capacity to do the work on a daily basis. While this work will be continuous and ongoing, Honokoa provided the ability to utilize all of these practices and see their collective power in strengthening relationships. Doing the work as practitioners also builds our capacity to share these practices with our communities through Ho'aina days, Huaka'i field trips, and workshops, so that these practices can become daily practices in our communities. Supporting moments of celebration and encouragement along the way was another way that ho'opaipai showed up in Honokoa. A beautiful example of this came when hosting a group of Kohala High School students who helped us to plant wili wili in our Kilohana Pa'ola unit. After learning the practice of planting and watering, they began to play music for the keiki plants, claiming that the wili wili enjoyed hearing the music and that they appeared to drink up the water. And this story demonstrates the importance of encouragement for both plants and people, and how those little connections can make the daily work a little more natural and enjoyable. And so our lessons learned from ho'opaipai, the practices that were once unfamiliar became comfortable and a necessity in our work. And many community members, I would say that the same is true for our staff team as well as community. So we had many community members return time and time again to join us for multiple Ho'aina days, and these practices became comfortable and familiar to them as well. It was also very rewarding to hear stories of these practices applied at home and in our communities. Another story of our Kohala High School students that was shared. They actually ended up sharing their planting practices and practices of ho'opaipai, the playing of music, with another community organization doing planting activities. So very rewarding to hear these practices continuing on in our communities. And many other community partners are leaders advancing similar practices. So also like to acknowledge and mahalo those that are contributing to making this a normal part of what we do in Hawaii once again.
And I just want to add here that as we think about ongoing ecosystem health, and in our particular context, the work of regrowing a forest, we recognize that this is work that is multi-generational and requires the help of entire communities. And so that's why ho'opaipai is so important, is we can't possibly regrow a forest on our own and within our own lifetimes. And so that return to daily practice is so important to see this work continue on. Our final practice that we'll be sharing today is aha, or holding ceremonial space. Aha, or ceremony, allows us to reconnect with each other and aina. When we talk about ceremony here, we're not talking about religious practices. While these ceremonies may be spiritual in nature and many draw from or are adapted from traditional forms of aha, the aha that we describe here fit our context and capabilities and are more reflective of the day and life ways that we live now. Aha can be large and elaborate, but are more often small and simple. They help us to connect connect holistically to each other and to our environment. We recognize that healing happens through ceremony, big and small, and through AHA, we solidify our commitments to ongoing kuleana.
A kuahu ceremony was the first AHA conducted in Honokoa. A kuahu is an altar and can be a temporary space. It's also considered to be a physical embodiment of the ecosystem. This ceremony involves an assemblage of meaningful gifts that represent our relationship to Honokoa and our prayers for Aina. And a kuahu ceremony was actually held 2 times at Honokoa, both at Keawewai and in the larger Honokoa area. We also conducted a pule ho'oulu, which is a simple prayer of growth and encouragement. And this was learned and shared each time a plant was planted in Honokoa. And it goes like, "Iola oe, iola mako nei." When you thrive, we thrive. So that was something that we tried to practice as a team when we planted, and as a community when we planted together. And Aha Ava was also hosted at Honokoa Makai by our Ohana of Kailapa to reconnect lineal descendants and community members with the Wahipana and share vai with Akua, Aina, and the newly planted niu in the area. But more importantly, the purpose of the AHA was to set our collective intentions as a community focused on restoration and stewardship from Mauka to Makai. Lessons learned from ceremony. Conducting ceremony allowed for the establishment of a sacred space in our daily lives and brought a spiritual connection and brought meaning to our work and connection to one another as well. It was a common experience to see and realize hoailona, or signs and feelings of pono following ceremony. Another takeaway was applying AHA in Honokoa was the feeling that ceremony should be incorporated into everything that we do. So I would say that ceremony is probably the newest of the practices that we've transitioned into. But there is this overall feeling that of the importance of incorporating it into everything that we do.
So to give just kind of a brief reflection over the work that we accomplished in both of these projects, we found that these Aina stewardship practices and Kohala stewardship practices that we applied at Honokoa proved to strengthen both Kanaka to Kanaka relationships as well as our relationships to Aina. And it's through those strengthened relationships that ecosystem health can be realized and sustained. Like we talked about, it's going to take our whole community, multiple generations, to really reach a place where our ecosystem is healthy and thriving and in balance with each other. These practices have prepared us to begin developing our own system of Aina accountability within the Kohala Center, and we will continue to implement all of these practices in our future projects. And again, just to remind everybody, Aina accountability seeks to answer the questions of how we might hold ourselves accountable to the places, communities, and individuals that feed and provide for us physically, mentally, and spiritually. And with that, we'd like to transition out of these 2 projects and talk a little bit about the current projects that we're involved with through the Kohala Center that carry over some of these practices, all of these practices that we've just shared with you.
So the first project, Malama Eke, and this is a new project of TKC that is being conducted on Queen Emma lands in the Eke Summit region of Kohala Mountain. The project is supported by multiple federal and state agencies and is estimated to continue through 2026. The purpose of the project is to protect 600 acres of cloud forest and the source waters of several South Kohala streams, including Keawewai and Kilohana. The project will enclose native cloud forest with fencing, remove feral pigs and invasive Himalayan ginger, and implement a comprehensive monitoring program, or KILO, to include water quality and water quantity, vegetation transect monitoring of both native and non-native vegetation, ungulate transect monitoring, photo point monitoring, both targeted and opportunistic, and just our overall general kilo and huli'ia of the area as well. So following on our accomplishments with the Honokoa project, our hope is to incorporate all of the stewardship practices shared today into our daily activities at Eke.
Another project that we're currently developing and engaging with is called Inoho Konohiki, and it's focused on developing a Hawaiian watershed management plan for Honokoa area. This project is supported by the Dorrance Foundation and is expected to continue through next year. And through this project, we're going to develop a Hawaiian watershed management plan for Honokoa that is based in Hawaiian values and practices like these 6 that we just shared with you. It's intended to be supplementary to the Honokoa Watershed Management Plan being developed by South Kohala Coastal Partnership and TNC for the Department of Health, and provide alternative perspectives and approaches to achieving long-term responsible management of the Honokoa watershed. So this plan will look at how we might integrate these practices and others into long-term management of Honokoa. And with that, we'd like to open up the space for any questions you folks might have.
I'd also like to mention that we're joined by a couple of our colleagues today. So if questions arise, we do have more folks that were included and have intimate knowledge of the Honokoa project. So ask away.
You can